The first thing I noticed about Mrs. Harper's house was the smell. It wasn't unpleasant, exactly, just strange, like old wood and dried flowers with a faint undercurrent of something metallic. My parents had warned me her house would be different, but they hadn't elaborated much. Maybe they were in too much of a rush to catch their flight to worry about my comfort. "Don't go into rooms you're not supposed to," Mom had said just before leaving, like planting a quick kiss on my forehead. "Be polite and helpful. She's a sweet old lady, Ben. You'll be fine." Mrs. Harper greeted me at the door with a tight smile, her wiry gray hair pinned into a bun so severe it looked painful. Her eyes, pale and watery, lingered on me for a moment too long, sizing me up like she wasn't entirely convinced I'd fit into her carefully ordered life. "Benjamin, isn't it?" she asked, her voice raspy as if unused to frequent conversation. I nodded. "Ben," I corrected, but she didn't seem to hear, or didn't care. Her house was dark, even though the sun was still high. Heavy curtains blocked most of the light, casting long shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The furniture was antique, polished to a mirror-like gleam, and the walls were lined with faded photographs of people whose faces seemed oddly blurred. Everything felt like it belonged to another time, a time when silence was heavier and rooms held secrets no one dared to uncover. "Your room's upstairs, second door on the right," Mrs. Harper said, already turning toward the kitchen. "Dinner's at 7. I don't like tardiness." Her instructions left little room for conversation, so I hauled my backpack up the creaking staircase. The wooden banister was smooth and cool under my fingers, worn down by decades of use. Upstairs was even quieter than the rest of the house. As I passed a door at the end of the hall, I felt an inexplicable chill. The door was unlike the others, sturdier, with a brass lock that seemed oddly out of place in such an old house. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, every old house has its quirks, and every old woman has her boundaries. But something about that door tugged at the edges of my curiosity, planting a seed I'd try to ignore. My room was small but neat, with a twin bed, a wooden dresser, and a single window overlooking the garden. From up here, I could see Mrs. Harper puttering around the backyard, her movements stiff but deliberate, a peculiar rhythm to her routine. She picked up a pair of shears and began trimming a row of hedges, her head turning sharply every so often, as if checking to see if she was being watched. I unpacked slowly, more to fill the silence than out of necessity. The house felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains seemed amplified in the stillness. Dinner was an equally quiet affair. Mrs. Harper served a bland stew with slices of stale bread. She didn't ask me about school or my friends like other adults usually did. Instead, she ate in focused silence, only breaking it to remind me to chew with my mouth closed or not to slouch. Afterward, as I helped her clear the table, I mustered the courage to ask her about the locked door upstairs. The question slipped out before I could think better of it. "What's in the room at the end of the hall?" Her hand froze midair, the plate she was holding hovering over the sink. For a moment, her expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. It was subtle, but unmistakable, a flicker of something dark and guarded. "Storage," she said finally, her voice clipped. "Nothing you need to concern yourself with." She didn't say another word for the rest of the evening. Later that night, as I lay in bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, I heard it for the first time, a faint sound, almost too soft to register. A low, muffled thud, followed by what sounded like footsteps. My heart quickened. The noise seemed to come from the direction of the locked room. I told myself it was just the house settling, that old houses make noises like that all the time. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the house. Something or someone was in that room. The muffled thuds from the locked room didn't stop. They were faint and irregular, like someone shifting their weight or testing the boundaries of confinement. I pressed my ear against the thin wall separating my room from the hallway, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. But no, the sounds were real. My stomach tightened as I considered my options. Should I go investigate, or was it better to ignore it, like Mrs. Harper had so clearly implied? Sleep was out of the question. The quiet of the house, broken only by the occasional creak of floorboards, seemed to amplify every sound. I lay awake, staring at the slivers of moonlight cutting across the room, trying to calm the unease twisting in my chest. Eventually, exhaustion won, pulling me into a restless, dreamless sleep. The next morning, the house felt even heavier, as though the secrets it held had grown overnight. Mrs. Harper was already in the kitchen, humming a slow, haunting tune as she sliced fruit for breakfast. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical. She didn't acknowledge me when I walked in, which suited me fine. I wasn't sure how to face her after what I'd heard. "You slept well, I hope," she said finally, breaking the silence. Her tone was polite, but there was something behind her words, an edge that felt deliberate. "Yeah, fine," I lied, hoping to keep the conversation short. She gave me a long, searching look, as if she could see through my words. Then she turned her attention back to the fruit, ending the conversation. I spent the rest of the morning in the small garden behind the house, pretending to be engrossed in a book I'd brought from home. Mrs. Harper hovered nearby, pruning roses and muttering softly to herself. From the corner of my eye, I noticed her glancing toward the house more than once, as if ensuring everything inside remained undisturbed. The thuds from the night before echoed in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about the locked room. I needed to know what was inside. As lunchtime approached, I made a decision. I would find out, but only when Mrs. Harper wasn't around. That opportunity came sooner than I expected. After lunch, Mrs. Harper announced she needed to run an errand and wouldn't be back until late afternoon. She didn't say where she was going or what the errand was, and I didn't ask. My mind was already racing with the possibilities her absence presented. The moment the front door clicked shut, I sprang into action. My heart pounded as I climbed the stairs, each creak of the steps sounding louder than ever. I reached the locked door, hesitating for a moment as the weight of what I was about to do settled over me. The key. I'd seen her tuck it into the pocket of her coat the night before, the same coat she'd hung by the front door before leaving. Racing back down, I fumbled through the fabric, my fingers trembling until they closed around the cool metal of the key. Back upstairs, I inserted the key into the lock, my breath catching as it turned with a quiet click. The door creaked open, revealing a room shrouded in shadow. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. The air was thick and stale, carrying a scent of sweat and something faintly metallic. Then I saw him. A boy, older than me, maybe 16 or 17, sat bound to a chair in the center of the room. His arms and legs were tied tightly, his head slumped forward, and a gag muffled his breathing. His face was pale, his hair damp with sweat. "Hey!" I whispered, my voice cracking with panic. "Are you okay?" His head shot up, his eyes wide with fear and desperation. He tried to speak, but the gag turned his words into garbled pleas. I rushed forward, fumbling to untie the cloth around his mouth. "Please," he gasped, his voice hoarse. "She'll come back. You have to help me. Call the police." The urgency in his voice sent a jolt of fear through me. I didn't understand what was happening, but I didn't need to. This wasn't right. None of this was right. Without another word, I ran downstairs, my hands shaking as I grabbed the phone to dial 911. The line seemed to take forever to connect, each ring stretching longer than it should. My hands trembled so much I almost dropped the receiver. When the operator finally answered, I could barely string together coherent sentences. "There's a boy," I stammered, my voice shaking. "He's tied up, locked in a room, my neighbor's house. Please, you have to send someone." The operator asked for the address, her voice calm but firm, and I gave it to her as quickly as I could. She assured me officers were on their way and told me to stay on the line, but I couldn't stand still. Every second felt like an eternity. I ran back upstairs to the room, my heart pounding. The boy's breathing was ragged, his body tense with fear. I crouched beside him, tugging at the ropes binding his wrists. "It's okay," I whispered, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Help is coming." "She'll be back," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "You don't understand. She's dangerous." A loud creak echoed from downstairs, the sound of the front door opening. My blood turned to ice. She was back. Footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate. She was taking her time, like a predator confident its prey had nowhere to run. The boy's eyes widened in terror, and I quickly stuffed the gag back into his mouth, motioning for him to stay quiet. The footsteps grew louder, moving toward the staircase. My mind raced. There was no way to lock the door from the inside, and there wasn't enough time to untie him and escape unnoticed. I darted to the corner of the room, pressing myself into the shadows, willing myself to become invisible. The door creaked open. Mrs. Harper stood in the doorway, her frail frame silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. Her face was calm, almost serene, but her eyes burned with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. "Did you think I wouldn't notice?" she said softly, her voice like a blade cutting through the silence. She stepped inside, her gaze sweeping the room until it landed on me. "You shouldn't have done this, Benjamin," she continued, her tone eerily calm. "You've made a mess of everything." I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the floor. Then, faintly, I heard it, the distant wail of sirens. Mrs. Harper heard it too. Her expression flickered, the calm mask slipping for just a moment to reveal something darker underneath. "You've ruined everything," she hissed, turning her attention back to the boy. "They won't understand. They never do." She took a step toward him, and something inside me snapped. I lunged forward, grabbing the only thing within reach, a heavy brass lamp from a side table. Before she could react, I swung it with all my strength, hitting her arm. She cried out in pain, staggering backward. "Stay away!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The sirens were closer now, accompanied by the sound of tires screeching to a halt outside. Red and blue lights flashed through the window, flooding the room with harsh, flickering light. A loud knock echoed from the front door, followed by the unmistakable shouts of the police. Mrs. Harper froze, her frail body trembling. She looked at me, then at the boy, as if calculating her next move. But before she could act, heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs. The door burst open, and 2 officers stormed in, their guns drawn. "Hands up!" one of them barked. Mrs. Harper raised her hands slowly, her face blank. The officers moved quickly, pulling her from the room and placing her in handcuffs. She didn't resist, didn't say a word. It was like all the fight had drained out of her. Another officer knelt beside the boy, cutting the ropes that bound him. "You're safe now," he said gently, helping him to his feet. The boy leaned heavily against him, his legs shaking. I stood there, frozen, as the chaos unfolded around me. Paramedics arrived shortly after, taking the boy to an ambulance parked outside. One of the officers stayed behind to question me, but I could barely focus on his words. My mind kept replaying the moment Mrs. Harper's calm facade cracked, the look in her eyes when she realized her secret was exposed. In the days that followed, the neighborhood buzzed with rumors about Mrs. Harper. The boy she had kept locked away was identified as a local teenager who had been missing for weeks. But when the police tried to question her, she refused to speak, her silence as impenetrable as the locked room she had so carefully guarded. No one could make sense of her motives. Some said she was deranged. Others speculated she had been planning something far worse. But the truth, whatever it was, remained a mystery. The house was boarded up soon after, left to rot along with its secrets. And me, I couldn't walk past it without feeling the weight of everything that had happened inside. The sounds, the smells, the fear, they stayed with me, a shadow I couldn't shake. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch myself staring at the dark windows of the house, wondering if the answers were still trapped inside, locked away where no one would ever find them. The storm came out of nowhere. One moment, the road stretched endlessly under the setting sun. The next, it was swallowed by a thick curtain of sand. My windshield wipers scraped uselessly against the onslaught, and I had no choice but to slow to a crawl. I hadn't seen another car in miles, and the vast, empty desert of Utah made the isolation feel almost tangible. That's when I saw it. The flicker of neon through the haze, a faded blue and red sign that read, "Motel Blue Horizon." The building looked like it had been forgotten by time, a relic of the 1960s with its chipped paint and sun-faded plastic letters. It wasn't ideal, but with visibility dropping to 0 and the gas gauge on empty, it felt like my only option. I pulled into the gravel parking lot where just 2 other cars sat motionless, blanketed in dust. The air outside was stifling, and I had to shield my eyes from the swirling grit as I made my way to the office. The saguaro cactus beside the door leaned at an awkward angle, like even it wanted to leave this place. The interior wasn't much better. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an eerie glow over the peeling wallpaper and mismatched furniture. Behind the desk sat a man with thinning hair and a cigarette perched between his fingers. His name tag read Earl, and he greeted me with a tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Rough night to be out on the road," he drawled, stubbing out the cigarette in an overflowing ashtray. "Yeah," I said, brushing sand off my jacket. "I just need a room for the night." Earl handed me a pen to fill out the check-in form. His gaze lingered on me, assessing. "We've got plenty of rooms. You're in 12, down the hall to your right. Just don't go near 13. The comment caught me off guard. "What's wrong with 13? "Maintenance issues," he said quickly, his tone sharp. Then, as if trying to soften the blow, he added, "It's just better to stay out of it." I didn't press further. Everyone had their quirks, and maybe Earl's involved spooky room stories. Still, as I walked down the dimly lit hallway, I couldn't help but notice the number 13 etched faintly on a door. It was taped shut with strips of duct tape, and the handle bore scratches, as though someone or something had tried to claw their way in or out. My room wasn't much better. The bedspread was an outdated floral pattern, and the smell of disinfectant barely masked the underlying mustiness. A TV sat in the corner, its screen dusty, and a single chair was tucked under a small wooden desk. Tossing my bag on the bed, I tried to shake off the lingering unease. After a quick shower, I stretched out on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The storm outside had worsened, the wind howling as if it were alive. I tried to relax, convincing myself the isolation and the oddities of the motel were just playing tricks on me. But the air felt heavy, too heavy, like the silence was hiding something just out of reach. The first sound woke me just after midnight. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, something faint and distant, like furniture scraping against the floor. I lay there, staring up at the cracked ceiling, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Old buildings creak, I told myself. It's just the wind pushing against the walls. But then it came again, louder this time, a deliberate dragging sound from somewhere close by. I sat up in bed, my heart thudding. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the motel sign bleeding through the thin curtains. I strained to listen, and for a moment there was only silence. Then from the direction of the hallway, I heard it. A low thud, followed by a shuffle, like someone moving unsteadily. My first instinct was to grab my phone, but it was useless. The screen read, "No service," and the Wi-Fi the motel promised didn't seem to exist. My stomach churned as I realized I would have to investigate. I pulled on my jacket and hesitated by the door, listening for any other sounds. The hallway was dimly lit, the buzzing overhead light casting long, uneven shadows. The air felt colder here, as though the building itself was holding its breath. I walked slowly, each step on the creaky floor amplifying the uneasy quiet. As I approached the taped-up door of room 13, the dragging sound started again. It was louder now, rhythmic, like someone deliberately pushing something heavy across the floor. I stopped, my eyes fixed on the door. The duct tape fluttered slightly in the draft, and I could see faint scratches near the base, as though a wild animal had tried to claw its way inside. Against my better judgment, I reached out and touched the handle. It was cold, unnaturally so, and the instant my fingers brushed it, a loud bang from the other side made me jerk back. I stumbled a step, my pulse racing. The dragging sound had stopped, replaced by a low, muffled whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Pleading, desperate. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, but something rooted me in place, a morbid curiosity that wouldn't let go. Before I could gather the courage to act, a new noise shattered the stillness. Back in my room, the TV clicked on, its sudden static crackling loud enough to send a jolt through me. I spun around, heart hammering, and bolted back down the hallway. When I re-entered my room, the TV was blaring, its screen flickering with black and white noise. I grabbed the remote and hit the power button, but it didn't respond. I tried the buttons on the TV itself, but nothing worked. Then, without warning, the static stopped. The screen went dark, and for a few seconds the room was completely silent. I stepped back, breathing heavily. My foot caught on something, and I turned to see the chair from the desk had moved to the center of the room. I hadn't touched it. The air was icy now, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. I felt watched, as though something unseen had settled into the space with me. Then, a knock, 3 sharp raps came from my door. "Earl?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I approached the door cautiously, peeking through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but the uneasy feeling in my gut wouldn't leave. I glanced back at the chair, now angled slightly toward me, like an unwelcome guest waiting to make its move. The knock came again, louder this time, and I turned back to the door. Summoning what courage I had left, I unlocked it and swung it open. The hallway was still empty, but something felt different. The taped-up door of room 13 was ajar. A thin line of darkness spilled into the hall like a shadow bleeding from inside. I slammed my door shut, locked it, and pressed my back against it. Whatever was happening, I wasn't going to find out. I needed to leave. Now. The decision to leave wasn't a question anymore. It was survival. My instincts screamed at me to get out of that place, to run and never look back. I grabbed my bag, threw on my jacket, and reached for my car keys. The storm outside still howled, but I didn't care. Whatever was waiting beyond the motel walls had to be better than staying here. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting to see something, or someone, waiting in the hallway. But it was empty, the dim light flickering overhead. My eyes darted to the door of room 13. It was still ajar, the tape hanging limply, like whatever was inside no longer needed to be confined. I hesitated for a moment, a primal fear pulling me toward the exit, but a darker curiosity anchored me in place. Something about that room felt wrong, like it was calling out, daring me to look. Against my better judgment, I stepped into the hallway, each creak of the floorboards echoing in the suffocating silence. The closer I got to room 13, the colder the air became. My breath misted in front of me, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I reached the door and peered inside, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was shrouded in shadow, the faint light from the hallway barely penetrating the darkness. The furniture was overturned, chairs scattered, the bed frame splintered, and the walls were covered in deep, jagged scratches. In the center of the room stood a single figure, barely visible, its shape wrong, shifting as though it couldn't quite hold itself together. I froze, unable to move, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure turned slowly, its form elongating unnaturally as it fixed its gaze on me. There were no eyes, just an overwhelming sense of malice radiating from where its face should have been. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into complete darkness. The air grew heavy, pressing against my chest, making it impossible to breathe. A voice, not quite human, whispered in my ear, a guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Why did you come?" it asked, the words dragging out like nails on a chalkboard. "You shouldn't have looked." I stumbled backward out, my hands fumbling for the doorknob. It wouldn't budge. The shadows around me began to move, coalescing into shapes that darted and twisted, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. I could feel them closing in, their presence suffocating. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, I threw myself against the door. It burst open, and I tumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. Behind me, the room was pitch black, the shadows writhing like living things. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I sprinted down the hallway, my feet barely touching the ground as I reached the exit. Outside, the storm was relentless, but I didn't care. I fumbled with my car keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. The engine sputtered to life, and I floored the gas pedal, my tires kicking up gravel as I sped out of the parking lot. In the rearview mirror, the motel loomed in the distance, its flickering sign casting an eerie glow over the storm. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the doorway of room 13, watching me. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I didn't stop driving until the sun began to rise, the barren desert slowly giving way to civilization. My hands still trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, the events of the night replaying in my mind. I didn't know what I had seen, and I didn't want to know. All I knew was that I would never return to that place. In the weeks that followed, I tried to forget, but the memories lingered. The shadows, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. It haunted me. I looked up the Motel Blue Horizon once, out of morbid curiosity, but found nothing. No records, no reviews, no mention of it anywhere. It was as if it had never existed. Sometimes late at night, I dream about that room. In the dreams, the door is always open, and the shadows inside are waiting, their whispers calling me back. When I first started working the night shift at St. Vincent Rehabilitation Center, I didn't think much of it. It was just a job, organizing medical supplies, checking on patients, and making sure the place didn't fall apart overnight. The pay was decent, and the hours were quiet enough for me to focus on saving for nursing school. I liked the solitude, or at least I thought I did. The center itself was a sprawling concrete relic from the 1950s, set on the outskirts of town. During the day, sunlight streaming through its large windows gave the place an almost welcoming feel, but at night, it was a different story. The hallways were dim, lit only by flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly, casting uneven shadows along the walls. The air always smelled faintly of antiseptic, mixed with something older, harder to name, like mildew and regret. My coworkers warned me about the third floor on my first day. It wasn't anything specific, just vague mutterings about bad vibes and weird stuff up there. I laughed it off, chalking it up to the usual superstitions that crop up in old buildings. Still, something about the way Luis, the janitor, looked at me when he mentioned room 307 stuck with me. "If you hear anything," he said, avoiding my eyes, "just leave it alone." That first week, I didn't notice anything unusual. My rounds were uneventful, the patients were quiet, and the third floor was as empty and lifeless as I expected it to be. But then, during my second week, little things started to happen. It was small at first, lights flickering more than usual, the faint sound of footsteps when I was sure I was alone. One night, as I was restocking supplies, I swore I saw a shadow dart across the far end of the hallway. When I went to check, there was nothing there but the faint hum of the HVAC system. I tried to shrug it off, but the feeling lingered. The air on the third floor always felt heavier, colder. I noticed that other staff members avoided going up there unless they absolutely had to, and no one ever talked about room 307 unless it was to tell a story, different versions of the same urban legend. A patient died there under mysterious circumstances. A nurse quit after hearing whispers late at night. Another swore they saw the curtains move when the room was supposed to be empty. One night I found myself standing in front of room 307 during my rounds. The door looked like any other door in the building, plain, white, with a silver number plaque bolted to it. But as I stared at it, I felt an inexplicable chill run down my spine, the kind of primal fear that hits you before you even know why you're afraid. The air around me grew colder, and for a moment, I thought I saw the handle twitch, as if someone had tried to open it from the other side. I backed away quickly, my heart pounding. When I mentioned it to Luis the next morning, he just shook his head. "You felt it, didn't you?" he said, his voice low. "That room, it doesn't like to be disturbed." I wanted to laugh it off, but the look in his eyes made me think twice. Whatever was going on with room 307, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The flickering lights were the first sign something wasn't right. It started about halfway through my shift, just as the clock in the nurse's station ticked past midnight. The bulbs overhead buzzed, then dimmed briefly, leaving me bathed in a faint, eerie glow. I chalked it up to old wiring. This place had been standing since the 1950s, after all, but when the lights came back on, I noticed it. Room 307's door was ajar. I froze, a clipboard clutched in my hand. I was certain the door had been closed earlier during my rounds. I had seen it, shut tight like all the others. Yet now, it stood open just enough for darkness to spill out into the hallway like ink. The air around me seemed to thicken, growing colder with each passing second. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and leave, but curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I approached the door, each step echoing unnaturally loud in the empty corridor. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No response. The closer I got, the more the temperature seemed to drop. By the time I reached the door, I could see my breath in the air, small white puffs that vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. My hand hovered over the doorknob, unsure if I wanted to push it open or slam it shut. From inside the room came a faint sound like the rustling of fabric. I leaned closer, peering into the sliver of darkness beyond the door. The dim light from the hallway barely penetrated the room, but I could make out the outline of a bed, a chair by the window, and something else. A shadow. It wasn't moving, but it was there, just at the edge of my vision, like a smudge against the air. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. That's when the door slammed shut in my face. The sound reverberated through the hallway, rattling the walls and sending a sharp jolt of adrenaline through me. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my clipboard. For a moment, all I could do was stare at the closed door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't dare open it. Instead, I turned and hurried back to the nurse's station, where I found Luis mopping the floor. His eyes met mine, and he frowned. "You saw something, didn't you?" he asked, his voice quiet. I hesitated, then nodded. The door, it opened on its own, and then it slammed shut. I think there was something inside. Luis set down his mop and wiped his hands on his shirt. "I told you to leave it alone," he said, his tone almost pleading. "Whatever's in that room, it doesn't want visitors." I wanted to ask more, but a loud crash from down the hall cut me off. Both of us turned toward the source of the noise, our hearts pounding. The sound had come from the direction of room 307. "I'll check it out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Luis shook his head but didn't stop me. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, I made my way back to the room. The air was colder than ever, and the hallway seemed darker, the buzzing lights overhead flickering weakly. When I reached the door, I found it open again, this time wide enough to reveal the room's interior. The bed was empty, its sheets rumpled and hanging off the edges. The chair by the window was tipped over, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, darker, almost alive. As I stepped inside, the door creaked closed behind me, leaving me alone in the freezing, suffocating stillness. Then I heard it, a faint whisper. It was coming from the corner of the room where the shadows were thickest. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I pointed it toward the sound, but the beam of light seemed to vanish into the darkness, swallowed whole. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and I could just make out words, "Get out!" My pulse raced, but my feet felt glued to the spot. The voice, low, guttural, and filled with an unnatural urgency, seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Get out!" it repeated, this time louder, more forceful, each word crawling under my skin and wrapping around my nerves like a vice. The flashlight in my hand flickered, the beam of light stuttering as if even the device itself was trying to give up. I turned, ready to flee, but the door wouldn't budge. The knob refused to turn, no matter how hard I pulled and twisted. Panic clawed at my chest as the temperature in the room plummeted even further, my breath now coming out in shaky, visible puffs. Shadows rippled along the walls, moving in ways that defied logic, bending and stretching as though they had minds of their own. Behind me, the whispering returned, this time layered, as if more than one voice was speaking at once. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear, angry, desperate, accusing. I spun around, the flashlight catching a fleeting movement in the corner. A figure? No, it couldn't be. But I wasn't staying to find out. I banged on the door with my fists, shouting for Luis, for anyone. My voice felt small and insignificant against the oppressive silence that followed. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the whispers stopped, leaving behind an eerie stillness that pressed against my ears like a vacuum. The silence was worse. My heart felt like it might explode as I pressed myself against the door, willing it to open. And then I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. Cold, impossibly cold, its grip firm and unrelenting. I froze. The air caught in my throat as I fought the primal urge to scream. Slowly I turned my head, but there was nothing there. No hand, no figure, just the suffocating darkness and the shadows that seemed to writhe with anticipation. Then, the door flew open, nearly throwing me off balance. I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air as I collapsed against the wall. Luis was there, his face pale, his hands gripping my arms to steady me. "What the hell were you thinking?" he hissed, his voice sharp with fear. "You don't go in there alone." I couldn't speak, my lungs still burning, fried, my mind racing to process what had just happened. Luis pulled me to my feet, glancing nervously at the open door of room 307. Without another word, he slammed it shut and twisted the key in the lock. "You stay away from that room," he said, his voice shaking. "That's not something you mess with." "But what is it?" I finally managed to croak. "What's in there?" Luis looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he simply said, "A mistake, something that should have been left alone." I didn't push him further, at least not that night. Instead, I spent the rest of my shift pacing the nurse's station, jumping at every sound, every flicker of the lights. The shadows felt longer, darker, as if they were watching, waiting for me to make another mistake. I wanted to leave, to quit on the spot, but something kept me tethered. Maybe it was the fear of not knowing, or maybe it was the small, stubborn part of me that needed answers. Whatever the reason, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't done with room 307, and it wasn't done with me. I barely slept after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw shadows curling around me, heard the whispers echoing in my ears, and felt the cold grip on my shoulder. St. Vincent was no longer just a job. It had become something darker, something personal. I needed answers, even if they terrified me. The next evening, I arrived at my shift early, my mind buzzing with questions and half-formed plans. Luis avoided me, muttering under his breath whenever I got too close. He knew something he wasn't ready to share, and that made my resolve even stronger. I decided to face room 307 again, not out of bravery, but because I couldn't live with the fear anymore. Whatever haunted that room, I had to confront it. The third floor was emptier than usual, the silence heavier. The air felt thicker with every step I took toward room 307. By the time I reached the door, my hands were trembling. It looked exactly as it always had, plain white, unassuming, with a tarnished silver number. But now it felt like the room was waiting for me. I took a deep breath and turned the handle. The door opened without resistance, revealing the dark, cold interior. This time I came prepared. My flashlight was new, bright, and steady, its beam cutting through the oppressive darkness like a blade. The bed was made, the chair upright, the room eerily untouched, but the temperature was freezing, and the air hummed with a low, almost imperceptible vibration as if the room itself was alive. "Is someone here?" I called, my voice shaking. It sounded absurd, but I had to ask. Silence answered me, followed by a faint rustling from the far corner. I swung the flashlight around, and for a brief moment, I saw it. A figure, hunched and indistinct, its edges shifting like smoke. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely shapeless either. Two dark pits where eyes should have been stared back at me. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping and frantic. Words I couldn't understand filled the room, their tones pleading, angry, desperate. The shadows around the figure stretched out toward me, clawing at the light, their movement unnervingly fluid. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice breaking. The whispers faltered for a moment, replaced by a deep guttural growl that sent a jolt of terror through me. The shadows surged forward, and suddenly the door behind me slammed shut, trapping me inside. My flashlight flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. The growling grew louder, closer, until I felt the same icy grip on my shoulder as before. I turned, swinging the flashlight wildly, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the suffocating cold and the weight of unseen eyes watching me. Desperate, I fumbled for the door, clawing at the handle. It wouldn't budge. The whispers turned into screams, a cacophony of voices that made my head pound. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The growling, the whispers, the oppressive cold, all of it vanished in an instant. The room fell silent, the air still. I turned the handle again, and this time the door swung open. Luis was standing in the hallway, his face pale, his hands gripping a rosary. "You shouldn't have gone in there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told you to leave it alone." "What is it?" I demanded, my voice hoarse. "What's in that room?" He shook his head, his expression grim. "It's not something you can fight. It's not something you can understand. That room, it's a wound, a scar left by something terrible. It draws things in, things that shouldn't exist." I didn't know what to say. My legs felt weak, my mind spinning. I stumbled past him, down the hall, past the nurse's station, and out the front door. I didn't stop until I was in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. That was my last night at St. Vincent. I never went back. Luis was right. Whatever haunted room 307 wasn't something I could face. It wasn't something anyone could face. Some places are just wrong, and no amount of logic or bravery can fix them. Years later, I heard the center had closed down. They said it was due to budget cuts, but I knew better. St. Vincent still stands, abandoned and forgotten, its halls empty, except for the shadows that linger in room 307. I wonder sometimes if they're still waiting for me. The house was unusually quiet that night. I sat curled up on the living room couch, the soft hum of the TV filling the space with just enough noise to keep the silence from becoming unsettling. Mom and Dad were working late again, something I was used to by now. At 12 years old, being left alone at night wasn't new, but it always left me feeling a little uneasy. Our house, with its creaky wooden floors and dim lighting, had a way of amplifying every small sound. It was a typical suburban home, nothing fancy, just 2 stories with a small basement we rarely used. Most of the time, the basement door stayed closed, tucked away near the kitchen like an afterthought. I'd never liked it much. It always smelled damp and felt colder than the rest of the house, even in summer. Still, it was just a basement, or at least that's what I told myself. I had settled in for the evening with a bowl of popcorn and a rerun of one of my favorite sci-fi shows. The flickering light from the screen cast long shadows across the room, and the wind outside rattled the windows faintly. It was cozy in a way, but as the clock ticked closer to 9, a subtle tension began to creep in. I couldn't place it at first, just a vague feeling, like something was slightly out of place. That's when I noticed the draft. It was faint at first, a cool brush of air across the back of my neck. I turned to glance toward the basement door, and my stomach tightened. It was closed, as always, but the tiny gap at the bottom seemed darker, as if the shadows there were thicker than they should have been. I shook it off. Houses creak, I thought. Drafts happen, nothing to worry about. I went back to the couch, focusing on the TV, but the feeling didn't go away. My eyes kept drifting toward the hallway where the basement door stood. Then I noticed the picture frame on the side table. It was lying flat. I distinctly remembered setting it upright earlier in the day. A shiver ran through me, but I forced myself to ignore it. Maybe I knocked it over and didn't realize. The wind picked up outside, howling now, and I turned up the volume to drown it out. That's when I heard the first sound. It was faint, like a soft tapping, barely noticeable over the noise of the TV. My heart skipped. I muted the show and listened, straining to hear. The tapping came again, more deliberate this time, rhythmic. It was coming from the basement. I sat frozen, staring at the door. My logical mind tried to brush it off as the furnace or pipes settling. The house was old, strange noises weren't unusual, but this didn't sound like pipes. It sounded like fingers, tapping lightly against wood. I told myself to stay put, but curiosity gnawed at me. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and tiptoed toward the basement door, my socks muffling my footsteps. As I got closer, the tapping stopped, replaced by a low, scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. My pulse quickened. Standing in front of the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. I told myself to turn around, to go back to the couch and wait for my parents to get home. But something about the silence beyond the door pulled me in, daring me to look. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hand still hovering over the cold brass knob of the basement door. The flashlight felt heavy in my other hand, its weight a small comfort against the gnawing unease creeping into my chest. The scraping sound had stopped, leaving only silence. But that silence wasn't comforting. It felt wrong, as though the house itself was holding its breath. "Just look," I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible. "It's nothing. It's just the furnace." The words sounded hollow, even to me. Taking a shaky breath, I tightened my grip on the knob and twisted it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing the dark stairwell that led down into the basement. A faint, earthy smell wafted up to meet me, damp and cold, the kind of smell that clings to forgotten places. I clicked on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. The stairs stretched downward, the light barely reaching the concrete floor below. I hesitated again, the thought of retreating to the couch flashing through my mind. But something in me, a mix of curiosity and stubbornness, pushed me forward. The wooden stairs groaned under my weight as I descended, each step sounding louder than it should in the stillness. The cold air wrapped around me like a damp blanket, sending goosebumps up my arms. The flashlight beam flickered slightly, and I shook it, my heart skipping a beat as the light steadied. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, stacks of boxes, and tools my dad never used. I swept the flashlight across the room, my breath visible in the freezing air. Everything looked normal at first, silent, still. But then I saw it. A faint movement in the far corner of the room, just outside the reach of the light. "Hello?" My voice trembled, the word barely escaping my throat. The flashlight beam wavered as my hands shook, and I aimed it toward the corner. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The darkness there seemed thicker, almost like it was alive, and then it moved again. The beam of light caught the outline of something. No, someone standing in the corner. It wasn't clear, like a shadow-given form, hunched and unnaturally still. Its edges flickered as if it didn't quite belong in the light. I froze, unable to breathe, my eyes locked on the figure. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting, boring into me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The air around me grew heavier, colder, pressing against my chest. The figure shifted slightly, a small, deliberate movement that sent a wave of terror crashing over me. That was enough to break the paralysis. I stumbled backward, nearly falling as I turned and bolted up the stairs. The flashlight swung wildly in my hand, its beam casting erratic shadows that seemed to chase me. My foot caught on the edge of a step, but I managed to catch myself, adrenaline surging as I reached the top. Slamming the basement door shut, I twisted the lock and pressed my back against it, my chest heaving. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. But then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping from the other side of the door, just like before. It was slower now, deliberate, as though it knew I was listening. I grabbed a chair from the kitchen and wedged it under the doorknob, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. I backed away, staring at the door as if it might burst open at any moment. The tapping stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that hung heavy in the air. I didn't know what to do. Calling my parents crossed my mind, but what could I tell them? That I'd seen... What? A shadow? My hands gripped the flashlight tightly, my knuckles white. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside, felt like a threat. I stayed there, rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the door. The rest of the night stretched endlessly before me, and I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to open that door again. I stayed pressed against the kitchen counter for what felt like hours, my eyes locked on the basement door. The chair I had jammed under the knob seemed pathetically small, as if it couldn't possibly hold back whatever was down there. But the door didn't move. The tapping had stopped, leaving an almost unbearable silence in its place. Every sound in the house set my nerves on edge. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the walls as the wind picked up outside, it all seemed amplified, sinister. I clutched the flashlight tightly, its faint warmth grounding me in the reality of the moment. But even the flashlight couldn't stop the growing sense of dread. What had I seen down there? My mind raced, replaying the moment over and over. It wasn't a person, at least not a normal one. The figure had been wrong, its shape blurred, its edges shifting like it didn't belong in this world. And those eyes, or whatever they were, I could still feel their weight on me, like they had left a mark I couldn't shake. I thought about calling my parents, but stopped myself. What would I even say? Hey, Mom and Dad, there's a shadow monster in the basement? They'd dismiss it as an overactive active imagination, a trick of the dim light and my own fears. And maybe they'd be right. Maybe. But deep down, I knew they weren't. The minutes dragged into hours, and exhaustion started to creep in. I wanted to sleep, but the thought of turning my back on the basement door was unthinkable. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, flashlight in hand, watching and waiting. The house was silent now, eerily so, as if it, too, was waiting. Then, just as the clock in the living room chimed 3 a.m., I heard it again. A single, deliberate knock from the other side of the basement door. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, frozen, at the door. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a sound that made my skin crawl. A slow, scraping noise, like nails dragging across the wood. The chair under the doorknob rattled slightly, and I felt my heart leap into my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, and my voice was trapped somewhere deep inside me. The scraping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural sound that wasn't quite a growl, but wasn't human either. It was coming from directly behind the door, and then silence. The house fell deathly quiet, as if whatever was down there had retreated or was waiting for me to make the next move. When the first rays of sunlight finally crept through the windows, it felt like a lifeline. The shadows in the room receded, and the cold, heavy air seemed to lift just slightly. I forced myself to stand, my body aching from tension and exhaustion. The basement door was still closed, the chair still in place, but I couldn't bring myself to remove it. When my parents came home later that morning, I tried to explain what had happened. They listened with patient smiles and dismissive nods, brushing it off as a bad dream or an overactive imagination. My dad even went down to the basement to prove there was nothing there. He came back up a few minutes later, shaking his head. "Just boxes and old junk, Ryan," he said, ruffling my hair like it was all some childish fantasy. Nothing to worry about. But I couldn't forget. The way the figure had moved, the weight of its gaze, it wasn't something I could explain away. For days afterward, I avoided the basement entirely, not even glancing at the door. At night, I slept with the flashlight clutched in my hand, the covers pulled up tight around me, as if they could shield me from whatever was lurking below. Weeks passed, and things slowly returned to normal, or at least as normal as they could be. My parents stopped asking why I refused to go into the basement, and I stopped trying to explain. But every now and then, when the house was quiet and the wind rattled the windows, I'd catch myself staring at the basement door, waiting for the sound of tapping or scraping. I never heard it again, but the memory lingered, haunting me in the quiet moments. I didn't know what I'd seen down there, and maybe I never would. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going back. Whatever was in the basement, it could stay there, and I would do everything I could to stay far, far away. The sun was already dipping below the horizon as I pulled into the driveway, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. My small house, with its faded blue shutters and a slightly crooked mailbox, greeted me like an old friend. I turned off the car, leaning back for a moment to exhale the tension from another long day. It was Friday, and the thought of 2 uninterrupted days of solitude was enough to make the exhaustion feel worth it. The air was sharp and cold, a typical December evening in Chicago's suburbs. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and headed toward the front door. My boots crunched against the thin layer of frost coating the concrete walkway. The faint hum of distant traffic was the only sound. Our neighborhood had always been quiet, something I valued more than I realized. As I reached the door, I noticed the porch light flicker faintly before staying on. I frowned, making a mental note to replace the bulb. I pushed the key into the lock and twisted, but it stuck halfway. Odd. I jiggled it until it finally gave way, opening with a reluctant creak. I stepped inside, closing the door firmly behind me. The house welcomed me with its familiar silence. I kicked off my boots, letting my feet sink into the softness of the hallway rug. The air carried the faint scent of pine from the candle I'd lit the night before. It felt good to be home. I tossed my bag onto the couch and flipped the light switch in the living room. The bulb buzzed faintly before flickering on. Another bulb needing replacement. I walked into the kitchen, intending to grab something from the freezer for dinner. The glow of the streetlights seeped through the window above the sink, faintly illuminating the countertop. I reached for the light switch, but something stopped me mid-motion. A faint glow already lit the kitchen, emanating from the freezer. I froze, my hand hovering near the switch. I distinctly remembered turning off all the lights before leaving for work that morning. My gaze fixed on the slightly open freezer door. A chill ran down my spine, sharper than the winter air outside. Probably just didn't close it properly, I muttered to myself, my voice breaking the silence. But even as I said it, I knew I'd closed it. I always double-checked these things. Still, I forced myself forward, the soft thud of my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The closer I got to the freezer, the stronger the unease grew. The pale blue light spilling out into the darkened kitchen felt unnatural, almost intrusive. My fingers tightened around the counter for balance as I leaned forward to push the door shut. Then I saw him. A man stood hunched in front of the open freezer, his back to me. He wore dark, tattered clothing, the kind you'd expect to see on someone who had been living on the streets for years. His shoulders moved slightly, as though he were rummaging through the shelves, completely absorbed in whatever he was doing. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I couldn't move. My mind screamed 1,000 questions. How did he get in? Why the freezer? Was this really happening? My heart pounded so loud I was afraid he'd hear it. I took a slow, shaky step backward, careful not to make a sound. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I knew any sudden movement could draw his attention. Another step. My hands trembled as I reached the edge of the hallway. He didn't turn. He didn't even flinch. Once I was out of sight, I bolted for my bedroom. The door slammed behind me as I twisted the lock with shaking fingers. My chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, my fingers fumbling to unlock it. 911, what's your emergency? The calm voice on the other end was a stark contrast to my frantic words as I explained there was a man in my house, someone I didn't know, someone who had somehow gotten inside. The operator assured me officers were on their way and instructed me to stay on the line. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. I sat on the floor with my back against the door, clutching the phone like a lifeline. The house was deathly quiet again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, just beyond the door. The silence pressed against my ears, thick and suffocating. I strained to hear any sound beyond my bedroom door. My breathing was shallow, the phone clutched tightly in my hands as the operator's voice occasionally broke the stillness, reminding me that help was on the way. The moments felt infinite, each tick of the clock dragging out as I waited. Then, faintly, I heard it. A soft scrape, like something being dragged across the kitchen floor. My heart seized. I closed my eyes and held my breath, trying to focus on the sound. It stopped, leaving only the thudding of my heartbeat in my ears. The quiet was worse somehow, filled with the tension of what might come next. "Do you hear anything now?" the operator asked gently, her voice grounding me for a brief moment. I swallowed hard and whispered, "I think he's still out there. He's moving around." My words felt small, insignificant against the weight of the situation. The operator reassured me again, but her words barely registered. My focus was glued to the hallway beyond the door. Was he still in the kitchen? Had he realized I was here? My mind spiraled with possibilities, each worse than the last. Then, a new sound. A slow, deliberate creak. The floorboards in the hallway. He was closer now. My body tensed as I heard another creak, this one louder. My fingers hovered over the lock on the door, but I didn't dare touch it. If he tried the handle, what would I do? My eyes darted to the closet. Could I hide there if it came to that? The steps stopped just outside my bedroom. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp, my whole body trembling as I waited. The door handle didn't turn, but I could feel his presence on the other side, like a tangible weight pressing against the barrier between us. The seconds stretched unbearably long, and then footsteps again, moving away this time. My stomach dropped as I realized they weren't retreating to the kitchen. They were heading toward the living room, toward the front door. I didn't dare move, still frozen in place, until I heard the faintest shuffle and then the unmistakable sound of a door opening. Relief surged through me, but it was fleeting. What if he wasn't leaving? What if he was locking me inside? I whispered to the operator, "He might be leaving." She encouraged me to stay put, but my mind raced with the possibility of escape. If he was outside, this was my chance. My trembling hand reached for the lock, but I hesitated, the weight of the unknown keeping me rooted. A sharp knock at the front door shattered the moment. My breath caught again, and for a split second I thought it was him coming back. But then I heard the voice, loud, firm, and commanding. "This is the police. Open up." Relief and panic flooded me in equal measure. I scrambled to my feet, unlocking the bedroom door and stepping cautiously into the hallway. The house felt larger, emptier, the oppressive silence replaced by the sound of heavy boots forcing the front door open. A flashlight beam swept through the living room, casting sharp shadows on the walls. "I'm here," I called out, my voice shaky as I stepped into the light. The officer closest to me motioned for me to stay where I was, his partner moving further into the house. "Are you alone?" he asked. I nodded, my voice barely audible. There was a man. He was in the kitchen. He was looking through my freezer. The officer gave a small, disbelieving frown but said nothing. He gestured for me to stay by the door as the other officer finished his search. I could hear drawers being opened, doors creaking as they were checked, and finally the sound of boots returning to the living room. "Nothing," the second officer said, shaking his head. "No one's here." But he was. My voice came out louder than I intended, edged with panic. He was right there at the freezer. I saw him. He walked through the hallway. "You have to check again." The officers exchanged a glance before one of them spoke. "No sign of forced entry. No damage to the locks. Are you sure you saw someone?" I hesitated, the certainty of what I'd witnessed colliding with the absurdity of the situation. "Yes," I said finally. "I'm sure." They checked the house once more for good measure, but the result was the same. No signs of an intruder. No footprints. No open windows. Nothing disturbed except for my nerves. The officers reassured me they would patrol the area, but I could see the doubt in their faces. When they left, the quiet returned, heavier than before. For the first time, my home didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a question I couldn't answer. Why the freezer? How had he gotten in? And why couldn't they find him? The house felt foreign in the hours after the police left. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was oppressive, almost alive. I locked every door and window again, double-checking them, even though the officers assured me nothing had been tampered with. My hands were still shaking as I collapsed onto the edge of my bed, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Sleep wasn't an option. My mind raced with questions and possibilities. I replayed the scene in the kitchen over and over. The man's hunched back, his dark, tattered clothes, the way he moved with singular purpose. Why the freezer? What had he been looking for? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was a desperate vagrant looking for food. But the way he seemed so focused, so deliberate, made that explanation crumble under the weight of unease. A faint creak echoed from somewhere in the house. My pulse spiked, and I held my breath, listening intently. It was probably the old wood settling in the cold night air. At least, that's what I told myself. But my body refused to relax. I stayed awake until dawn, the faint light creeping through the blinds, offering a brief reprieve from the suffocating darkness. Exhausted but still on edge, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the freezer door. I'd cleaned up the smudges on the handle earlier, a weak attempt to reclaim some semblance of control. But now, in the harsh morning light, it still felt menacing, a portal to something I didn't understand. By mid-morning, I had installed an app-controlled security camera aimed at the freezer. It wasn't just paranoia. I needed proof. I needed to know that what I saw wasn't just a trick of the mind. For the next few nights, I avoided the kitchen after dark. I kept my routine tight, staying in well-lit spaces and keeping the bedroom door locked. But the feeling that something was wrong never left. Every shadow seemed longer, every sound heavier, like the house was holding its breath. Then, 3 days later, the footage from the camera arrived on my phone. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The notification came at 3:13 a.m. I hesitated, dread coiling in my stomach, before opening the app. The video was grainy, but clear enough to see the empty kitchen bathed in pale light. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with no warning, the freezer door swung open. I froze, watching as the door revealed the cold, foggy interior. No one was there. No figure stepping into the frame, no shadow or hand reaching for the handle. It opened as though the freezer itself had decided it was time. Then the light inside began to flicker. The faint blue glow pulsed, growing brighter, almost blinding before the screen went black. The video ended abruptly, leaving me staring at the empty playback bar. I rewound it, watching again and again, hoping to catch something I'd missed. But the footage was the same every time. The door opening on its own, the unnatural light, and then nothing. I called the security company the next day, explaining what I'd seen. They told me the footage wasn't corrupted and that the camera was functioning perfectly. Their explanation only made things worse. The nights grew harder to endure after that. I avoided the freezer altogether, even during the day preferring takeout to anything stored inside. The sense of being watched, of not being alone, became unbearable. Finally, after a week of torment, I decided to throw the freezer out. It felt ridiculous, but I couldn't keep it in my house any longer. I hired a removal service and made sure to be away while they hauled it off. But even after it was gone, the unease remained. It wasn't just the freezer, it was the house itself, like it had absorbed the strangeness and now refused to let it go. I moved out a month later. I didn't tell the landlord the real reason for breaking the lease. Who would believe me? Who could explain what happened? I'm in a new apartment now, in a busier part of town, surrounded by the comforting noise of life. But some nights, when the world is quiet, I still hear the faint hum of a freezer door opening. I'll never know who the man was, how he got in, or what he wanted. And maybe it's better that way.